I would like to formally welcome Dr. Helen Baum from Institute of Adult Learning, and IAL is at present with Singapore University of Social Sciences. Although I have not, I'm not sure if I have met Helen, but I have definitely listened to her and I have referred to her works. And I have known her from, I used to be from SIM University. So at that point, SIM University was, we had some projects with Andrew Brown, and I was familiar with Helen's work at that time as well. Helen has a lot of extensive work in workplace and adult learning, and that is what we are hoping to tap onto in today's talk as well, the principles of learning design. And I hope that this brings in some connection for SUTD folks in terms of design projects with capstone projects, with real life design projects and things like that. Helen is originally from Australia. Helen?
Yes, yeah,
Yes.
Tasmania. In fact, all my background pictures tend to be from Tassie.
I see. Okay. So without much ado, I want to start and pass on the space and time to Helen right now. Thank you so much for doing this session for us, preparing the slides for us and meeting our colleagues. We hope that you will also be able to interact with our colleagues, and perhaps this can transpire to some projects for both, you know, IAL as well as yourself and our colleagues at SUTD.
Fantastic.
Thank
Sounds
you.
great. Okay. And what you were saying about going back to Andrew Brown, that is a long time ago. Wow.
Yes. I think nearly 20 years now. Okay.
No, 11. Yeah. Okay. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you this model for designing learning, or learning design. And the model actually gets us paying attention to our changing world and developing what I refer to as future orientation. I don't like the word future ready because it indicates a fixed end point, whereas future orientedness suggests that we keep growing, that it's a journey and there's no arrival point, if you like. Okay, so we've all been designing learning for many years, I can well imagine, and change has also become pretty much a norm, and especially so, of course, with COVID. So, but the trouble is that across the globe, educational institutions are really slow to respond to changing needs and contexts, like big ships trying to turn them around. So there's one of the key questions I like to ask is, what are we preparing our learners for? And we all know about the dynamically changing landscapes in terms of the rapid changes in different technologies, the changes in work in terms of performance expectations, the design of the work, and we can go on. Different changing relations and forms of production. So while we still got forms like aspects of craft production and mass production, we're increasingly seeing things like the co-configuration, where products or services are produced in collaboration with the customer, and that's high level knowledge work, that form. And of course there's all the changes in labour markets with the increase in non-permanent workers and so on. So all of which means that the learners that we are working with are in this state of transition, or there's a need for preparedness for multiple transitions over a lifetime, and even within one temporal space. At the same time, these sort of changes mean there's an increasing demand in many types of jobs, but not all, for increased cognitive and social, what Deming calls skills. I have issues with that term, but I'll use it because it's the common terminology. So basically here we're talking about what MOE refers to as the 21st century skills, or other literature talks about as the top 10 skills or whatever. Variously, there's plenty of overlaps between whatever terminology and whatever literature you look at. So we've all been part of this rapid transition to e-learning due to COVID. And for many of us, it's been pretty massively daunting sort of stuff and incredibly intensive, to wit, the changes in work and technology. So our immersion into e-learning actually provides us with opportunities to reflect on how we as educators design and facilitate movement across different kinds of learning spaces. This diagram's a bit of an old one now, but it's actually looking at learning different spaces between classroom and work, and we should add in the e-learning space or the tech-enabled space here, and how that's the spaces in between classroom work, tech-enabled spaces. So many of the, in the CET sector, many of the programs and courses that we have studied in our blended learning, Sense Making for Blended Learning project, indicated that educators often find this quite a difficult thing to do because there tends to be an abruptness between one space and another. There's no fluidity. There's not necessarily thinking about how to best use each space and how to best transition between spaces. So this idea of the use of spaces is one of the key underpinning principles of the 6 principles of learning design. And given this move to blended learning at the national policy level and also at institutional levels, it's a really important thing to be thinking about. So the use of these different spaces means that we need to attend to bringing authenticity into, not obviously it's there in the workplace, but also into the classroom and tech-enabled spaces. And these words that I've used a different colour for are related to the 6 principles, right? So the other question is to be thinking about what do different kinds of spaces enable for learning that's holistic and future-oriented. And I'll explain what I mean by that a bit later on. And what opportunities are there in these different spaces for feedback and judgment in the different spaces and in the in-between spaces. So this space in between is generally a temporal one. So it is the activities that we might be requiring of learners to undertake in that time, but it's also the really informal stuff that goes on. And as we know, learners tend to set up WhatsApp groups and so on. It's a really important informal space for their learning. It's these kinds of things that we need to be considerate of. So other key concepts that underpin the 6 principles of learning design is that we think of learning as happening in everyday activities. Learning is more than just what takes place in a classroom. We say that context is absolutely important. It really matters when it comes to learning because it provides affordances and opportunities and barriers and constraints. So it gives us, or denies us, access to particular tools, to particular types of knowledge. Particular types of knowledge are valued differently in different spaces. So the practical knowledge is, in general terms, valued in a workplace. More theoretical academic knowledge, in general, is valued more in educational institutions. So all these things about ways of thinking and so on are part of the different spaces and different kinds, hence the different kinds of contexts that we are in. So learning happens through everyday activities. We're exposed to information. It's what we do with that information that means it's about learning. So we are also underpinning these 6 principles is the idea that learning and assessment are entwined. They work together, right? They are not learning and then assessment. So here we're talking about all those things around not just summative assessment, obviously, but formative assessment and what David Bell calls sustainable assessment. And by sustainable assessment, David is referring to the idea that we develop learners' ability to make judgments about their performance and the performance of others, this quality of the work that's being produced in the learning situation or in the work situation, wherever it is, or whatever the type of performance is, be it a written performance, be it a practical performance, or a combination of both. So what we're saying then is assessment is not about testing something, it's about making judgments about performance, right? So it's not about the reproduction of knowledge and testing that. It's whether or not we have performed to a required or expected standard. And so the emphasis, where there is an emphasis in constantly testing the reproduction of knowledge, you know, this little diagram, you don't fatten pigs by weighing them, right? That's a kind of test, right? How does that impact on learning? It doesn't, unless you've designed something like an online quiz or something where learners can return again and again. But I'm sure this is all something that you're very familiar with. The other thing is that learning involves identity work. In other words, we're saying learning is about being and becoming. It's a journey, a never-ending journey, hopefully. So this identity work is that sense of becoming a particular type of practitioner, a particular type of professional or vocational identity, or role, you know, a manager or whatever. Okay, so what it means to be and what the qualities are of a particular type of work or profession. So a little bit more on learning, because this is so key to the whole idea of the 6 principles, is that in competency-based environments, and I know you guys work with way more than this, but learning involves much more than KSA, the knowledge, skills, attitudes. So this quote from Richard Edwards that is very applicable here. He's saying that the transformation of understanding, identity, and agency is what learning is about. So I think those words about transformation, which indicates considerable change, but change in some form, understanding, I talk about deep understanding, you'll hear me talk about that later on, and this identity and agency. Agency, the sense of having a sense of confidence and feeling a sense of power, if you like, to be able to act on what you know. And then the idea that knowledge is not something that is just the domain of a particular expert, such as an educator or a teacher that stands at the front of the class. We work within the 6 principles of learning design with the idea that knowledge is co-created, that therefore we need a very dialogic sort of approach to our design of learning. And what we hope to do is that to develop learners who are knowledge co-creators or builders. And this is really important to the ongoing learning to learn capabilities of our learners post a course. Because in the process of creating knowledge, and I'm not necessarily talking about knowledge as, wow, I've never heard about that before. This is about developing their own knowledge, their own understandings, and synthesizing things. It's those higher levels of cognitive activity, if you like, that are undertaken in a very dialogic fashion where the learners have some control and they're interacting between theory and practice and that means that authenticity in your design becomes important. I'll say more about that shortly. So as Hinchcliffe says, he's referring here to lifelong learning, but learning that does not focus on workplace identity is unlikely to promote in any substantive way the ability to handle transitions. So we've heard, I've been talking so far about the transitions that our learners are in at the moment that they will experience constantly in the future. And the same with us as educators. So, and I've also talked about the idea of identity. So these are the sorts of concepts around learning that are important when we think about designing learning using the 6 principles. And one more point before I move on to the 6 principles is that many of you will be familiar with these time-honoured models and approaches to designing curriculum and planning lessons and so on. ADDIE is a model that's oft taught in our teacher education courses early on, and some of you, especially those in the CET space, will may well be familiar with this. So this model was developed in the 1950s, so it's very old now, in the 1950s by the US military. And yes, it's about curriculum design, and it's a design process. And as you can see by the numbers, and those of you who are familiar with it will know that it is structured as being sequential. But we know that as curriculum designers, designing curriculum is very messy. We're iteratively moving around this sort of process. Yes, we do all of these things, but it's not linear. It's very iterative and model. And this ADDIE model says very little about the fundamentals of learning, and certainly nothing about learning in the ways I've just described. So what I'm saying is that, you know, it's time we rethought some of these sorts of approaches. And while these sort of models have their place, we need to interpret them in ways that are useful to us in today's world, and be realistic about their application and the way we use them when we actually design learning. So the other one that's really common is Gagne's 9 events of instruction. This is for lesson planning as opposed to curriculum. And this can often helpful for beginning teachers. It's very teacher-led. It positions the teacher as expert, with learners needing to respond to teacher prompts and however they design. And although group work, in other words, dialogue, may be included, it's not fundamentally dialogical, as or nor does it necessarily imply that you work with the learner's experiences, for example. And this last point, number 9, enhance retention and transfer. The idea of transfer for me is highly problematic as a metaphor. What comes to my mind is that we transfer from one context, say a classroom or some kind of structured learning environment, to, say, a work situation. And we all know it doesn't happen like that. It just doesn't, right? There's so much more learning that has to be done in the process of applying what and putting to work what we have learned in a classroom or tech-enabled setting, or in a community setting or family setting, whatever it is. Sorry. So, in fact, instead of the metaphor of transfer, Karen Evans and David Giles talk about the notion of putting knowledge to work. They use this term recontextualization, because putting knowledge to work better captures what actually is going on as you apply knowledge in and across different settings. All right, so let's move now towards the 6 principles of learning design. The sources of the 6 principles of learning design, there was some initial thinking that informed our thinking, if you like, of the project that these principles came from. So the initial project around that was actually on developing non-permanent workers in Singapore. We've published a book with Routledge on this. It's now available in paperback. And the key idea here is, if you see the diagram down the bottom here, and this, you probably can't read it, but it's craft, entrepreneurial, and learning to learn. The key idea is the swirl in the middle, that all of these different types of capabilities are integrated in the way these learners learn these on the job, and that learning is informed by their individual disposition, right, and the way they make meaning and the way they see the world, and the context which they are in, which provides them with different affordances and opportunities. So that's some of the core thinking which informed the interpretation of some of our much of the data that was coming through when we worked on this project of assessment for the changing nature of work, in which we undertook 6 ethnographic case studies and 105 data points. So this is the model, and I've just realised that this diagram lacks this. Yeah, this is the correct diagram. So these are the 6 principles: authentic, alignment, holistic, future-oriented, feedback, and judgment. And you may recall that I mentioned these earlier, except for alignment. The key ones are authentic and alignment. And if you have, you're working with a concept and build in authenticity, then much of the rest follows. And it's just basic common sense that all elements of your design need to be aligned with each other. But let me explain what each of these are. Noting though that from all these lines you can see that each is connected to and related to the other. Some have very tight interconnections, such as feedback and judgments, but all are related to the other and feed into the other, but they are also standalone in a sense when we can think about them separately as well. So the authentic, I didn't check, this should read, instead of dimension, it should read principle, sorry about that. So authentic refers to real-world problems or issues or tasks that reflect the complexities of the work. So in this sense, something is authentic when it's anything from you have a learner in a real work setting for whatever reason, whether it's an hour doing observations or whether it's a 3-month internship or whatever. Anything from that to using real world problems or issues or tasks in the classroom or online. And this idea that you can pick up stuff from what actually goes on in the real world, if you like, is you can take further by ideally working with learners' issues and problems. Now, depending on what you're teaching, that's not always possible, but in the longer courses that we do in our universities, this is very much possible. So I think it's something that we can aim for, and also means that you're much more likely to get a dialogue happening, a real dialogue, inquiry dialogue going on, if you work with learners' real issues and problems. And I'll be giving examples of these later. So holistic refers to the integration of all the different types of capabilities. So technical and soft skills, for example. The integration of theory and practice. It's also very much about the idea of learning to learn. Sorry, not learning to learn, about embodied learning, right? That we feel in our bodies. It's not just something that happens in our mind. We feel in our gut, we feel with all our 5 senses, stuff that's going on in learning, when we're learning. Future-oriented, this is where the learning to learn applies, the metacognition. That's what that's about, along with developing deep understanding. So that's about how we constantly evolve our capabilities and the ability to meet unknown challenges. So in that sense, that's why we call it future-oriented. Feedback is very much about a dialogue. It's not a one-way process, and it's not from just one person. Feedback is about giving and receiving feedback from and to multiple sources, which can include yourself, the individual learner, their peers, the ROs, the reporting officer in a work situation, the lecturer. But also when you're as an individual or as a team member or whatever, you are making sense of that experience when you're undertaking practice experiences and also in doing the work. And so this is a source of reflection, and in a sense it becomes a form of feedback. This is something that we can use this idea we can use in the design and build in this type of self-reflection and so on. So in a sense, we're constantly having a dialogue with ourselves and others to improve performance. So judgment is, as I've mentioned before, making judgments or assessments of our own work. You know, of learners making judgments about the standard of their own work and of their peers. To do that requires a sort of transparency. So this is where things like rubrics, assessment rubrics, are really useful, where the learners actually use them to make their own assessments of their own and their peers' work. And the conversations that are had in the process of doing this are quite revealing, where they recognise, oops, all right, yes, I'm good on this, but I really haven't, for example, critically reviewed the literature, right? So they make their own realizations. That's much more powerful than being told, you need to, right? And alignment, of course, is, as in Biggs's alignment, that all aspects of the curriculum are related to and interconnected with each other. So when you hear examples such as writing a course on writing reports, where the assessment was a multiple choice test, right? That is clearly not aligned. The alignment would more likely be there if the assessment task was about writing a report for a particular audience, preferably of their choosing. Okay, so these 6 principles actually require changes in the division of labour, in our beliefs and also our practices. So I'm going to start with beliefs in relation to learning. And this is what the continuum I've got here at the bottom of the page. It comes from Sard's 1998 Metaphors of Learning article that's been much cited. She talks about acquisition and participation. So acquisition approach to learning, understanding of learning, is where learning is considered as a product of knowledge that the individual acquires and holds. It is theirs to own. Often with that, it assumes that, the emphasis on individual and largely sort of cognitive approach, although not necessarily, because the learner can also be making sense of what they're learning through interaction with others. But it doesn't necessarily take into account the embodied nature of learning, for example. Participation, on the other hand, moves away from individual, although it acknowledges the importance of individual, and places an emphasis on learning as social, as highly interactive. Now, theoretically, the strict interpretation of the socio-cultural perspective of participation is that it does not include social cognition, for example. But in fact, we know that social cognition is a really important part of participating and engaging in things. So participation also situates learning in context, and very much takes account of context, as I talked about earlier. So the access to the tools and rules and the all those constraints and opportunities for learning. So another thing we need to think about when using the 6 principles of learning design is our perspectives of knowledge. The K here stands for knowledge. So we can consider knowledge as static, as non-changing, or we can can consider knowledge as emergent and co-constructed. Now, the argument is that there are certain theoretical principles that don't change. In fact, I would suggest otherwise, because our understanding is constantly changing as different research is done on whether it's fundamental physics or even mathematical principles and so on. However, it can be much slower to change. So we may be teaching the same basic content knowledge in these types of theoretical aspects. It doesn't change. But in reality, we can take that kind of technical knowledge and also conceive of it as emergent and co-constructed. Because what we're doing here is moving from a position of knowledge is static, so therefore as a teacher, I need to teach it to them, to the learners. And I am the source of the expert. I am the expert, the source of the knowledge, along with all my knowledge of the literature and so on. Whereas we can provide resources to learners, get them to make their own understandings. So although what you want them to learn remains the same in terms of content, it is the learners that are making sense of that and constructing together their own understandings of it. That then you are a resource to direct and correct and so on. All right. So here, for the 6 principles of learning design, by and large, we work with the idea of knowledge as emergent and co-constructed. Right? But just as with the metaphors of learning, acquisition in terms of practices such as the lecture, we still need these, but we're not necessarily talking about lectures that are hours long or an hour long. We're talking about mini lectures, if you like, that are just in time. And of course, things like the e-learning, where we've put up pre-recorded lectures that are often much shorter, is an example of this that I think is quite good practice. Okay, so the role of the learner also changes. So you can see that along the right-hand side, there's a few things lining up similarly on the left-hand side. So on the left-hand side, the acquisition metaphor is more in line with considering knowledge as static and more in line with learner as a passive recipient of what is being taught. Whereas on the right-hand side here, in terms of the role of the learner, we've got the learner, you can see how it lines up with participation. The learners actively engaged as part of the community, they're problem solvers, they're critical questioners, they're reflexive. They not just are, they're being that, and that's also where you're aiming to develop them. So the learner's very actively engaged and part of the community. And that means that the role of the educator shifts from educator being expert and source of knowledge to expert as facilitator, critical questioner, plus what's below. So plus what's in the box. So educators, facilitator, scaffolder, increasingly handing over responsibility to learners as they gain in capability and capacity and confidence and so on. So this is about how you scaffold the learning. All right, so what are some examples of the application of the 6 principles of learning design? I'm just going to pause here for a moment. One of the things about this type of delivery is the lack of ability to read body language. I have no idea whether you're with me or what, so I'm ploughing on. All right, so just getting back to the slide, here I've divided this. The next 3 slides are like this. We've got a learning activity here. We've got the degree of authenticity. We've got the principles that it applies to and how the learning activity meets the principle. All right, so let's look at what the learning activity is. So if, for example, you want to link and relate concepts through the use of concept maps, where the learners are drawing concept maps, You can get them to do that individually and then perhaps work together to draw a group one, or start straight with a group development of a group concept map to make and see connections or relationships between key concepts or particular processes, whatever it is. And then you might do things like, you know, gallery walk, some technique where they share and critique each other's and keep building on what they've developed within each group. So in terms of degree of authenticity, I have here theory work, applying and integrating theory and practice, skills practice. This I need to rework. It's not very well thought through, but we can see that clearly this activity of concept maps, it involves the use of theory, but we also, I would suggest, applying and integrating theory and practice, because as learners decide what goes into the map, they will draw on their own experiences of the application of the concepts that are being used to make sense of the connections and make sense of how to structure the concept map, right? So in that, because the learners are interacting in these sorts of ways, they're saying, oh, what about putting in XXX? Then others will say, yes, no, maybe, how about, and so on. So they'll be giving feedback, there's consideration, and there's actually also judgment of the ideas going on that I haven't listed here. It's, so it's also future oriented, because it contributes to deep understanding and it's helpful for constant learning to learn processes, because in this where they're doing this sort of concept mapping process, learners are actually co-constructing knowledge, you know, their understandings of the key ideas and concepts. And in that sense, they're deepening their understanding. And every time they do this, then it becomes wider and deeper. So in my master's course, for example, I get learners to do this a number of times throughout a 7-week inter-semester course. And they're always amazed at when they look back at what they had at the beginning to what they have at the end. And they think, wow, you know, that's amazing, that journey, right? So it's very affirming for the learners as well. All right, so another example, 2 examples here, might be identifying and naming hazard, where individuals, the learners draw workplace hazards and label them, or they explain it verbally, why these are hazards. And then there might be discussion about the different solutions and why particular solutions are better than others. So this is authentic in that obviously it's very related to work itself and reflects the complexities of work, because not only is it identification of hazards, which is lower cognitive level, but solutioning, you have to take into account what's possible in particular work situations. So what's possible in one work setting may not be possible in another. So again, there's judgment going on here. In terms of the authenticity, again, you're applying theory and practice. So the same sort of reason feedback's going on in the way that we talked about in the concept mapping. And again, it's also future oriented because it's contributing to deep understanding. It's particularly as the discussion happens around the different learning solutions, the different solutions to the hazards, that the deepening understanding is. So in order to develop solutions, you have to deeply understand the nature of the hazard. Right? It's one thing to identify and put a name to it. It's another to appreciate the nature of that hazard and the real implications, short, long-term, and the range of those. All right, so another example is where learners, with the permission of those being photographed and the setting in which it's happening, is for the use of photos and discussion. So in a class situation, you might start out with discussing the purposes of learners taking the photos, and then in a workplace setting, they take the photos of real setting around for a particular purpose, right? That's been discussed up here previously in the class. And then there's a sharing of those photos and identification that, for example, many ways in which you could use this, but one is that you could talk about how the particular service or practice or whatever it is, or product, whatever, could be improved. So again, you're working, it's highly authentic because you're working with the real work settings. And again, you're integrating theory and practice. So because you're doing this, it's holistic, it combines theory and practice. And again, and feedback and judgment, for the same reasons we've talked about already, future oriented, they're again deepening their learning, deepening understanding, and also their analytical capability. These both these examples do that, where they're making the judgments about solutions or how things might be improved. And the final one here is practice skills in and looking after yourself in terms of health. When you're transferring patients from one, for example, from a wheelchair to a bed or vice versa. So typically the educator will demonstrate the technique and talks through the principles. So basically good practice demonstration happening here. And then the students work in groups of three. I mean, you'd be familiar with this, where they take turns in different roles. And but this is where it gets interesting. The class draws up a list of criteria against which they will assess each other in their groups. So, depending on the class, you might do some of this earlier and not rather than go through all of this before you get to this stage. And then there might be a bit more practice with using that criteria where students give feedback to each other. And so the educator there is roaming and giving advice and so on. And then the whole class comes together to finesse the set of criteria. And so here you've got the development of really good practices around a process of transferring, in this case, transferring patients, but you could use it for many different things, that looks after both the patient and the back and so on of the carer. So, and the same sort of thing. We've got judgment, holistic, and feedback, again, for all the sorts of reasons we talked about here. So judgment, they're making judgments about the standard of performance, especially when they're using the criteria and developing the criteria. And holistic, clear integration of theory and practice, self-care, knowledge of bone and muscle structures and so on, as they're lifting, stretching and so on. So it makes them become very aware how different movements and different parts of the body operate and how it feels. Learners are constantly giving and receiving feedback, as well as feedback from the educator. So there's some really simple applications in the use of these principles. I have used it, and I haven't got the examples here, but as I indicated earlier, I've used it in a master's course. And the key thing here is that for the assessment in that course, I ask learners to identify, the course is about workplace learning and performance. I ask learners to identify a workplace learning issue in their workplace, and we then have one-on-one with them to scope the issue and so on. But thereafter, they have to interview a number of people, so it's very inquiry-based to identify, do they really understand what the issue is? And always after that process, they say, oh, wow, I thought the issue was only X, Y, Z, but it doesn't look like that at all. It looks like this, So they've learned a lot about what the depth and the breadth of the issue and how it's named and thought about in that workplace. So they have to then write up the enablers and constraints for learning in their workplace in relation to that. And then they have to design a learning intervention to address the issue, as well as develop a stakeholder management plan. And throughout the course, they're constantly making judgments about each other's work, about they're constantly working between theory and practices. They undertake the readings and talk about it in relation to their own workplace learning practices. So it's highly authentic, lots of judgment going on, lots of feedback going on. It's holistic, and it's also future oriented. The learners, and we've done a study using this course and others, where the identity work that I talked about before and the metacognitive stuff is very strong. All right, so to conclude, the 6 principles of learning design very much assumes learning as participation, and preferably we're talking about learner choice and a very dialogic approach. It's reflective of the complexities of work and occupational practices. It assumes that learning is about identity development and agency, the development of deep understanding and the development of mastery and expertise. So in that sense, it's very future oriented. And of course, it enables learners to transition across these changing landscapes of work and labour markets. So that's it from me. So I look forward to your questions.
Yep. Are there any questions? I'll just kick start with a doubt that I had earlier. The earlier slides, when you're applying the principles of learning design, you had this authenticity and then the principles, right? So I got a little confused because the chart that you have, the one with the star, the framework, the 6POLD framework.
Oh, yes.
It
Okay.
also includes authentic.
Yes, you're right. Okay, sorry about that. Yes, you. Okay, I made a separate column of authenticity because it is so critical, right? That's the major one. Yes, it is one of them, but it's the most critical because if something is authentic, then it's much easier to put all the others in place. So that's why I pulled that one out separately. And people often think that as soon as you talk about things being authentic, they think, oh, it must be in the workplace. I can't do that, because I don't have access or I can't, whatever. But there are many ways in which you can do that, to capture those complexities of the work. I mean, it's great if it's in the workplace, but we also know that especially when we've got accredited programs, that we're going to work a lot in classroom settings, and we can, or online settings, and we can do that and still have authenticity. Does that explain? Yeah.
Okay. I have more questions, but I think we should take from the audience.
Yeah.
Colleagues, friends, any questions from you? You can just unmute yourself and ask. Everyone is good?
Yeah, I think the framework looks good, but I think in an adult learning situation, do we actually encounter times when the adults want to be passive learners? They just want to sit there and just tell me what I need to know, and don't make me learn actively. Yeah, and then what do we do? How do we respond in that case? Yeah.
That's a really good question. All right. So my experience with this is that in the sort of courses we're working with, I think we're lucky enough to have time to address this question. Historically, that's what many of our learners have experienced. That's what learning is. You're a passive recipient. And so they don't have the confidence or the skills or the aptitude to be active learners necessarily. However, if you structure the assessment such that it is required, then it makes all the difference. So that is a key motivator. So that saying about assessment drives the learning. And so our design of the assessment is really critical for this. So two things here, and I'll go back to my master's course as an example. The assessment, there's 2 submissions they have to give, but it all relates to their own workplace learning issue. So they cannot do the assessment unless they've identified their workplace learning issue, unless they've interviewed 4 to 5 or 5 or 6 people from their workplace and analysed those, unless they've developed, and for the second assignment, unless they've developed their learning intervention that applies to their issue. So that's one part of the assessment in relation to making it authentic. The other part is that I have as much as 20% where I give them in terms of not just participation, but knowledge co-construction, if you like. So it's about seeing that they are growing in their capacity to abstract, in their knowledge and understanding, their deep understanding of the concepts, the core ideas in what it is you're trying to teach in that topic. And so I have an assessment rubric that captures those things, and so I make a judgment. Right? And I talked before about assessment being a process of making judgment. I make a judgment about their individual level of participation. That's pretty easy, but also their knowledge co-construction abilities. I can provide that as an example if people are interested.
Right. Thank you very much. I think that was an interesting answer. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Yes, Helen, I have a question.
Yep.
Yes, Susan.
Okay. So with your principles of learning, how could we actually apply these successfully to learners who may come from different cultural and educational backgrounds, where language and previous exposure to the pedagogy may be constraints?
I actually see this as somewhat, language is one thing, but in terms of participation, I see that's a very similar question to what Norman was asking. And right. There's literature about the Confucian ethic in relation to teaching and learning, right? And the learner's role. So this thing about changing the role of the learner and of the educator, all of these things have to go hand in hand. And you're right, there's a lot of scaffolding we have to do to get learners to the ideal point we would like them to be in terms of being active. And they will be, and I've seen it with every group that I take, that they're initially very uncomfortable, really uncomfortable. There's a number that lap it up, and I think, oh, at last, I've got control over my learning. I can do this, and I can see where I'm going, and this is what I want to do.
That's true.
But others who, very much as you say, and Norman was saying, your role is to tell me what to do, and I'll do it. What do you mean you want me to work it out for myself? So what we're doing here is giving them the responsibility for their own learning, for them to take that on. Because traditionally what happens at the left-hand side of these continuums is that the educator has the responsibility for strategic learning, for the learning of the learners. We've got to switch that. We have to switch that if our people are going to be able to survive in today's constantly changing world, right? Even if they're not doing work that's deeply knowledge work, still in negotiating the labour market, you need this sort of understanding. So it's a question then, I think, of how you scaffold it. And so I think here, again, it's very dependent on the group and on there's some relationship between that and the topics that you're teaching. But again, attention to the design of assessment is important, but then how you scaffold it. So you might begin with something that's not right up the acquisition end, right? But something more towards the middle of the metaphors of the middle of all of these continuums here, and where there's lots of group discussion and so on. Because once you put them into groups, they're often okay. It's where they have to share in front of a whole class that becomes a problem. So you can gradually break that down by talking less. Because the more we talk as educators, the less learners are likely to participate, right? So we talk less, we give them more time, their voice more time and space, and we create safe spaces for sharing and for risk-taking. Risk-taking in the sense of, if I ask that question, it's just a dumb question, I'm going to be thought so stupid, right? So somehow we have to create that environment where there's that sense of trust, and it's okay. It's okay to ask whatever question. And it's generally the questions that are thought of as dumb that are actually the really good questions, or the really obvious questions that need asking. So I think you start by talking less, having much more group activity, and then you also do things like throw back to the learners when they ask a question. Oh, that's a really interesting question. Okay, so what would you do? Or what do you think? Or so you throw it back. And if there's a silence, you just move them into buzz groups or something. Right? And so that's a technique that I use quite often when I get this sort of silence, when they think, oh my God, I don't even know how to think about that. So they need think time. Fair enough. So give them think time. And buzz groups are really useful, quick technique for that. And then if there's still some sort of reticence, if the learners are really very uncomfortable with this type of interaction, then you can work from buzz groups up to and collapse the groups. So what's the name of that technique, where you start with a buzz group and then you share with the next buzz group, and it grows. You build the questions that each layer of grouping has to interact. I can't remember what you call it. It's not jigsaw, it's something else. So I think these kinds of techniques are where you can start. And if you've got, as a basic principle, authenticity, even those who are not yet in the workforce, because I'm talking about those who are in the workforce, for youth, they've always heard stories from their parents or older siblings or friends or family or something or other. Or you can, they're more than happy to share. And you can sort of set it up with them to say, look, I want you to, for tomorrow or next week or whatever, I want you to go and talk to a friend or whoever and try and get their experience or their whatever of whatever. So you can give them pre-warning of what it is you want them to share, to gather that information. And it's just it can be anything from a verbal collection of casual conversations on the part of the learner, through to something that's much more structured and formal. I think it depends on your purpose in the activity and the level of confidence of the learners. But if we always structure everything for them, they're never going to learn how to learn. So then if you give an activity and you think, oh my goodness, that went totally wrong, that fell totally flat, or that's really, I expected much more than that, and so on, then you just turn around and say, okay, what's going on here? So what were the issues and problems? And again, you wouldn't necessarily do it as a whole class. You might get them to analyze what was it they had challenged, what were they challenged with, what did they have difficulty with, what was easy to understand, and so on. So you get them to start analysing, and that's actually contributing to their learning to learn and to their metacognitive skills. You can also, in group discussions, pose some overall questions that might apply to almost every such group discussion. Things like, is the idea credible? right? Or how do I know it's credible? We might use whatever language is appropriate. Is you know, how does this relate to other things that we've been talking about? You know, these sort of critical, analytical sort of questions that you can start them off, and then as they become more confident, they'll develop their own. And again, you can keep surfacing what those sort of questions are that they're coming up with. As soon as we give them space and opportunity, it's amazing what any group of learners will come up with. These 6 principles, by the way, came from not the 6 principles, another approach, a dialogical approach, came from Sue Stack's dialogical inquiry approach. She was, for her PhD thesis, she worked with 16-year-old secondary school students in a physics class. And some of the sort of questions she was asking them were things like, how credible is it? You know, how the relationship between different ideas, these types of questions. And they very quickly got hold of that, and the quality of their work was truly amazing. Right? They were thinking and acting like scientists. So the 6 principles, I think, combined with a dialogical approach that we moving towards the right-hand side of these continuums is, I think, very powerful for learning.
All right, thank you, Helen. That was good. A very informed answer. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions for Helen? I think it's very interesting to see it from the perspective of learning design. You know, as focusing on the learners and learning, compared to instructional design of ADDIE or you know, when we are looking at instructional materials. But I think you know, putting the various different principles, whether if it is when it is face-to-face lessons, when it is blended lessons. I think face-to-face and blended, we are more or less very comfortable because everybody uses some sort of technology these days, you know, online tools. So it's quite fluid. But I realized that when I had to move the lesson, the teaching to completely online during this COVID situation, designing that kind of authentic task were sometimes limited by the technology, especially in terms of academic assessment. I think in terms of workplace assessment, maybe the assessment criteria may sometimes be different at workplace, whereas academic situations. So yeah, I just wanted to hear your thoughts on this framework for online context.
Okay, I think the framework applies to any space of learning, be it, you know, online or whatever. But I agree with you that actually, I'm not sure I agree with you in terms of the authentic bit, but in terms of the dialogic process, that I find that more difficult in the online space. You can do it, but it's not as powerful as it is face to face. And in terms of authentic, in the online space, you've got access to videos and those resources available, and the learners are really good at finding those, especially the young ones. You know, I'm just a boomer. You know, I don't see all sorts of things on the screen. And my stepdaughter goes, "Oh my God," rolls the eyes. So I think the authentic stuff we can still bring in. The difference here might be that you may not be drawing on the individual's work setting. However, if you have some sort of space where you can, a collaborative space where photos or something are shared in an easily accessible way, and again, I don't know programs where you can do that apart. I mean, there's all the platforms where you can just put stuff, but then you've got to open everyone, and it's painful. I'm talking about something where you can easily see everything that's shared in a similar sort of way to putting things up on a wall. But yeah, so the, you know, that use of photo example that I gave, or becomes something that can be captured. So it doesn't have to be use of photos where people are in a work situation. You can also use stories or whatever. Yeah, I mean,
I think structuring the learning is like what you said, the authenticity, it is quite possible online. The collaboration sometimes is limited, sometimes, yeah. And the assessment, I find, is the weakest link so far, because I think because of our academic setting, we want it to be like like there's proof that it is the students who are doing that work, that there is other kind of technical issues that comes with assessment, that they are not we are open to open book testing now, especially with authentic assessment, authentic activities. Many of them are using open.
What's the assessment? What sort of assessment activities are we talking about? You say open, like an exam.
Not so much of I think at SUTD we are quite aligned with your 6 POLD principles, and I think it is a fantastic alignment and reflection of what we are doing here as well. A lot of the activities are authentic. It tends to be aligned, building on from freshmore to the pillar years, and the assessment, it's some of it is quiz, some of it is exam, the usual cognitive tests, but there's also the design projects and so I think what they're doing now is they have our faculty members have quite a number of these online webinar series to for the students to present their projects. I don't know, what are some of the challenges that you guys are facing? Maybe, you know, as faculty members, what's some issues that you see in assessment in online? Anyone? I don't know. Norman, what do you think is, or Chi Hui? I think also because you're not teaching now this particular, I think this time is a break time. Like when COVID started, we still had lessons, right? So did it affect your authentic assessments?
Maybe I speak for the digital world experience. So actually, I think after a while we could come up with quite an authentic assessment, because our course is a computer programming course. So in the end, we came up with a solution that said, okay, now everyone go and write any game that you like and submit the code, and then we will interview you about the code using an oral exam. So I felt that that was actually quite an authentic assessment, because I mean, in practice, computer programmers write software. So that was quite authentic, and the fact that we could interview them, even though it was 5 minutes per student, is also quite authentic in the sense that, well, most of the time programmers have to talk about their code, and after writing it,
Thanks for sharing that. Chinwei, did you have something to share as well, Chinwei or Chi Hui? Because I saw the.
Okay. Not sure Chi Hui is doing here. I think it's probably something that he need to attend.
Okay.
So, but okay, actually, because I'm teaching physics, so frankly speaking, now this particular summer terms is the very first time we conduct the physics course totally online. So indeed, it's actually a challenge for us to, in terms of assessing the students and how to assess the students more accurately. So we actually focus on some key aspects of the learning that we want the students to achieve is the fluency in terms of the the concepts that we teach, how well can they actually apply the concept. So in this case, like even we set so we have put a lot of emphasis on how we set the questions. So instead of setting the questions that they can just simply fill in the blank, we actually require them to be able to apply the concepts in a more complicated way in order to be able to show that they truly understand and appreciate the concept. So there's a lot of emphasis on that. Of course, there's a lot of challenges as well, and we have to try to balance with the limited the time resource the students have during the test, and how do we test the students to be able to know that they actually learn something instead of just regurgitating what we actually pass on to them.
So do you
So
give
it's
them,
really a challenge.
sorry, do you give them authentic tasks as well, like Norman said?
Well, we have some we have this we have projects that the students really have to apply some physics concept that we teach in order to design something, and then we have presentations for them, question answers or report writings. But when it comes to physics, it is very difficult just simply to assess the students based on like a project-based learning. So we also have a lot of contents that are very specific concepts that we want to make sure that the students really understand. So when it comes to online teachings and online assessments, it is a little bit difficult to administer the way that we used to administer it, like have a written test, and from how the students present their logics and solutions, we can easily assess whether the student truly understand or not. So now everything is doing online, so it's going online, so it's very difficult to assess what we used to be able to assess based on the written test. So many of the tests we have to convert it to like an online test, like using multiple choice questions. So we have to set the questions, make sure that they are actually set at appropriate level, and they are not set in such a way that the students can just simply regurgitate whatever they see in the lecture notes or what we told them. So they really have to reflect some true understanding. Of course, this has been quite challenging for us to set every questions like that. But that is
it is very
aiming for.
challenging to design MCQ like that. One of the strategies that builds in feedback is to have those sort of quizzes, if you like, in that are essentially MCQ in an online environment where the learners can go in and go through it as many times, or you might set a number of X number of times, and you might set a particular percentage they get if you wanted as some form of summative assessment. But you can build in learning into that assessment, because there's a bank of questions, and every time they go in they might get some different, some the same, but they're learning every time they go through that process. So the idea here is not, the emphasis there is not on the test in that sense, it's on the learning, and so then how you position those sort of MCQs becomes is about, is it a test or is it about the learning? And then the application of the knowledge becomes potentially through the projects, and how the assessment criteria are designed in judging those projects. So yeah, I think it raises questions again about how we think about learning, about assessment, and about the purposes of our different types of activities they do, whether they're learning or assessment activities, or whether they're both. And often they're both, because as a teacher, any activity we do, we're constantly reading what learners are understanding, and we make these adjustments, especially in the classroom setting. Much more difficult online, but we're constantly making adjustments about, okay, we need to spend a bit more time on this, or I need to redesign this activity, or whatever it might be, yeah? Or I need to make sure I go and talk to so-and-so and so-and-so because they're obviously struggling, or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks, Helen, for the suggestions.
Yeah.
Actually, in fact, one thing about the challenges that we encounter when it comes to like the project-based learning is actually it's very difficult to ensure that everyone in the team, let's say we assign a small groups in the team to make sure that everyone actually achieve the same learning outcomes. And it's also
Absolutely, yes.
and so we try to restrict, we try to define the problems in such a way that it is more challenging, and we also try to restrict the size of the group. But sometimes we still struggle actually at this point in time to how, no matter how, sometimes we feel that the project is really nice, but the question is actually how do we ascertain the students actually get what we actually want them to achieve. Even we can conduct, let's say, an interview, it is very difficult to ask sufficiently broad questions to make sure that every student actually really learn sufficiently to a satisfactory level. So we're actually still struggling with it.
Yeah, it's not that's a core struggle. I think I agree that all of us grapple with, and my thoughts about the group projects, where I mean they're really important, as you say, into where you're working in a sector where there's a lot of collaborative work, and many professions are involved in collaborative work and cross-disciplinary work as well. So it's important to provide opportunities for that. The idea about, you know, there's always somebody in a group who carries the group, or quite often, right? You rarely get a group that where everyone puts in pretty much, you know, equally in some form. So the to have a reasonable amount of the, say for example, if the project is worth, for example, 50%, then you might have 25% that's the product, and 25% that's the reflection, each individual's reflection on the processes of the group work, which means they're also learning explicitly about the nature of collaboration and what happens. And where learners know that they're going to, you know, get reflections on them from others about their role, this can help, I think, the participation. But then it may also be more complex than that, I guess, because you're also talking about, they might produce a product, but then they might also need to produce a group reflection or an individual reflection on the processes that were gone through to produce that product, what it means in terms of the key concepts that are embedded in that, and what implications, or what, again, like you say, it depends on what it is you want them to get out of it. As soon as you get them talking about thinking about implications or evaluating, they're making quite high-level judgments that must involve the use of the application of theory in order to make the judgment about the standard of that product or whatever it is that's being produced or designed or whatever. Yeah, and sometimes the idea of getting learners engaged in developing some criteria to sort of practice around the idea of them making judgments can be quite powerful, and that may be that may be a sort of like practice activity that's not assessed. It's a formative, non-graded assessment, if you like.
Okay.
So it's for the learner. Yeah.
Thanks, Aaron.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thanks everyone for your participation, questions, and it has been a very engaging session. I would like to thank Helen for this wonderful opportunity to meet up and discuss on her framework. It has really been very helpful. It is so aligned with our work here at SUTD. We should think about something that that comes from this eventually, maybe, if you want to work with some of our faculty members. Thank you so much once again. I hope to catch you in person after COVID, and
Yeah.
you're always invited to SUTD.
Thank you. Yeah.
And
okay, thank you very much, everyone. I really enjoyed the discussion, and yeah, I'd love to have the opportunity to meet with you face to face at some time. Okay, thanks.
okay,
Thank
thank you.
you.
Bye.
Bye bye. Thanks
Bye-bye.
everyone. Thank you.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Bye bye.